Otaku Faithful, thank you for joining me again this week. Once again, it's Larry Williams, OAW Commander-in-Chief, and I'm here to bring you all yet again another Arrow episode review right here on Otaku Assemble! Weekly, and as always, here to bring you the latest in this week's Arrow episode review. And this is my review of Season 4, Episode 20, entitled Genesis. Now, general thoughts on this week's episode. Definitely a much better episode than last week, and I would even argue one of the better episodes of this season. Now, funny enough, I actually didn't find anything objectively wrong with this episode. I think that everything actually worked well within the confines of this episode, and certainly you can go ahead and bring up some questions that this might cause for the season as a whole and for the series as a whole, but by and large, this episode I thought was actually pretty solid. And I didn't think there was anything that the episode did bad. I'm not even sure there was anything that it could improve upon, because of course, just like with Legends of Tomorrow, this does feel like the first part of what could be considered to be a 4-part finale. So taking all of that into consideration, I actually think this episode was pretty solid, I'm actually going to spend this review discussing the items I think worked really well and the things I actually liked a lot about this episode. So first and foremost, the fact that this was a Diggle and Lila centric episode, I was totally stoked for that. I like Diggle. Once again, he's one of my favorite characters on the show, and I've always liked the storylines with him and Lila. It's kind of weird too, because they bring the espionage feel to the show, which is typically a genre I don't really favor, but the way in which they're always incorporated with their storylines, with the Argus storylines and whatnot, like, I always get a kick out of it. Number 2, this episode finally brought the conclusion to the Diggle family drama. It's over, it's done with, and I'm glad that it was finally resolved swiftly and absolutely. And yes, granted, it does bring up the question about, John killed Andy, and then he even lied to Lila about it, exactly about how it went down and whatnot. But the thing is, I am one of those people that think that heroes shouldn't necessarily kill villains. But on the other hand, John is not the titular character in this show, and Andy had to go. I'm sorry, homeboy had to go. He made it clear to John that he was never going to stop targeting his family, and he had to go. So the fact that that has finally been resolved, and it's been done absolutely, swiftly and absolutely, I mean, unless they decide to bring Andy back sometime later on in the future, which I think would be a terrible decision, I'm glad that that was finally put to rest, and I'm glad that Andy was finally put down. If nothing else, the actor portraying Andy, he has a knack for playing those shiesty, traitor-like roles. Now, granted, he did it well in this series to a great effect, but I'm glad that that book, that chapter's finally closed. Moving on. Another thing I really dug about the episode was the supernatural elements that we got in it. Pretty much in this week's episode, Oliver finally gets in contact with John Constantine, which I wish Ryan had returned to the series to, cameo in another episode, because I think he does a great job as John Constantine. Constantine. Moving on. So in this week's episode, Oliver finally gets in contact with him, and he learns of a shaman over in Hub City who could actually help him defend himself against Darhk's magic. And in doing so, we found out that Oliver's best bet in order to accomplish that is to pretty much try and harness the lighter forces that are inside himself, rather than that in eternal darkness that has kept being hinted at and foreshadowed to throughout the entire season. So what I dug about that whole thing, now number one, like I said, I'm a sucker for the supernatural. So the more supernatural elements they integrate into the series, I always get a kick out of. But just like in last night's Flash episode, what I dug about it was the fact that it didn't really work. Not the way that they thought it would. When Oliver did his little test, he actually failed it. And so I dig that, because once again, it's not just, that Deus Ex Machina out of nowhere instant solution, everything is all hunky-dory. No, there are some pitfalls to it. There are some consequences to it. You know, the idea that this is something that wouldn't be done overnight, that Oliver would actually have to struggle with, all of that I think worked really well. And the fact that Oliver was able to sort of harness that inner magic, if you will, to some degree, not to a great degree, but to a small degree, you know, it shows that, okay, at least he's making progress. Once again, not something that he can learn overnight, but slowly throughout the, you know, in the rest of the season, he could sort of get better at it. If nothing else, and once again, because I don't want to see a magic wielding Green Arrow, if nothing else, if they write it to where Oliver just gets to the point where Darhk's magic doesn't work on him at all, that I think is enough. I think that's enough. And once again, even if it's just for Oliver, like Darhk could still use his magic on everybody else, but just for Oliver, since of course he's the one that has to tangle with Darhk by the end of the season, if he gets to the point where where it just doesn't affect him anymore, that I think would be perfectly fine. The other thing, the thing with Thea, even that I thought worked out pretty well. Now granted, I think that, you know, you could kind of figure out what was going on relatively early, especially once Thea points out the fact like, hey, why do the noises outside sound like they're on a loop? The second she said that, you can kind of piece together what was going on in her little storyline. But I totally dug it, and I like that they went ahead and put a character on the inside of Genesis so that we can kind of see, you know, both sides of what's going on. We have Oliver and the rest of the team on the outside. Thea's on the inside. Now, granted, I will say this. If they end up turning Thea into a victim where she's either, you know, held, I mean, clearly she's being held against her will, as we saw by the end of the episode, but like if she gets captured and if she's held hostage throughout the climax of the season, I think that would be a really terrible mistake. If anything, Thea needs to be sort of on the loose, fully capable of being proactive and being constructive, and she needs to be able to operate, even if she's being held inside of what seems to be this underground nuclear bunker. That's what I got the feeling of what that environment actually was. Even if she's trapped inside of there, she needs to be able to operate within it. Okay, that way we can get both sides of this, you know, we can see both sides of this conflict as it's occurring. So all of that I thought was really good. Oh, another note, Adam, the political advisor, and of course Thea's love interest for this season, I even love the fact that he wasn't necessarily a mole, and it's not like he was working with Darhk and with his wife and whatnot. The idea that they pretty much just used him as a pawn, if you will, because of course he's under he's being drugged the entire time. Like even that I thought worked out really well. But all in all, like I said, solid episode. I'm actually kind of surprised, because after last week I didn't know exactly where this series was going, and I didn't really know how the season was going to wrap up. But I was impressed with this week's. So that's going to go ahead and wrap up this week's Arrow episode review. I want to thank you all for joining me again this week. And in the comments below, please feel free to leave your thoughts on this week's episode. Let me know what you guys are expecting for next week's episode. And let me know what some of you guys are expecting for the rest of this season. We only got 3 episodes left, so let me know what some of your thoughts on that are. If you like this video, please feel free to thumb it up, share it with other fans of the show and people you think would get a kick out of this review. And if you have yet to do so, subscribe to the OAW YouTube channel. Annotation will be above head. And with that being said, this has been Larry Williams, OAW Commander-in-Chief, signing off. And until next time, peace.